consequences, people are going to continue with this impunity. People must be held accountable.
We hear from Daniel Demelovo, immediate past Auditor General, who says his successor must do far more than just audit. Plus, we interrogate why some of the Auditor General's numbers conflict with the finance ministries.
This is Top Story with Evans Mensah.
And Top Story is always brought to you by Vodafone. Now, the jaw-dropping revelations in the latest Auditor General report into the use of billions of COVID-19 funds is tonight fueling demands for immediate sanctions against government officials responsible for much of the dissipation. The Auditor General found many cases where the total of 21.8 billion cedis mobilized to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 pandemic in Ghana was simply misused. In one case, the Auditor General flags what he calls a possible case of financial loss totaling $81 million worth of vaccines we paid for but never received. We are learning that in spite of this potential loss, with the vaccine still not delivered, government has this year budgeted more funds to import vaccines. More on all that shortly. But first, immediate past Auditor General Daniel Demelovo is demanding sanctions against government officials found to have dissipated the funds. He was speaking to my colleague Blaise Soga on the Pulse on the Joy News channel.
I was going to actually audit the COVID expenditure in 2020 before leaving office. This is because the novel coronavirus and COVID-19 Act, which is Act 1013, requires the Auditor General to audit the financial statements relating to their revenue and expenditure and report on it within 6 months after the end of the financial year. So we're preparing to do that before I left. And I must say that I commend the Auditor General and his team for the work done. But it is sad that we are seeing this level of wastage at a time where there are no fiscal space, as a result of which even people who lent money to government cannot be paid. However, people are wasting government money this way. It's sad to say the least.
Do you feel we should be doing more?
Exactly, we should be doing more, more in different fronts. One, there should be consequences for these infractions. If we do 1,000 audits and there are no consequences, people are going to continue with this impunity. So I think and I recommend that there must be consequences, or people must be held accountable so that we can avoid the recurrence of this. I also expect that in line with the provisions of the Act 1013 that are referred to, there is the need to have an annual audit on this COVID trust fund. And so we are waiting for that report also. Looking at the report that was issued by the Auditor General, a very good report with good findings, and I commend him and his team for it. There are serious infractions. In fact, you just mentioned a lot of them. One of them which intrigued me was the situation where Ministry of Health have contracted a finance lease agreement for 15 million and over, which is covering 25 good years. My goodness, why would you do that? And even here is the case, there was no feasibility studies, or nobody went to check whether the facility was fit for purpose. And after this agreement, we are told 20-point-something million is going to be used in reformatting or reshaping the place. And I'm like, who in his normal sense will do this? If not because people are getting away with infractions. So I think we can do more from both the audit side and also enforcing the findings of the audit.
One has got to do with your track record on surcharge. What do you feel is accounting for this inability of the audit service now to go ahead and exercise that constitutional mandate?
As to why there is no disallowance or surcharges recently, I think the best person to answer that should be the Auditor General.
But you want him to go ahead and surcharge, do you?
Of course, yes.
So that's Daniel Demel over there. My colleague with the Reset Desk, Kofi Ajay, is joining me now as we scrutinize the Auditor General report more closely. Kofi, let's start with the vaccine revelation. So the Auditor General found that we paid in excess of $120 million to UNICEF and AVAT for the supply of vaccines. Now, however, just over 5 million of those doses was supplied to us at $38.3 million. Now, the Auditor General notes that, the supply of that amount left an outstanding of $81.8 million worth of vaccines that was not delivered to us as a country, although we needed it so badly. Now, this could result, the Auditor General, I'm quoting the Auditor General here, this could result in financial loss if the contract is not renegotiated to ensure recovery of the outstanding amount under the contract. Now, we've been getting some clarity from this on this particular matter from the Director General of the Ghana Health Service, Dr. Patrick Kumabwaji, who says is the nation's inability to store the vaccines. That is why we were unable to take delivery of the rest, although we paid for it. Listen to it.
We bought about 16.9 million doses of Johnson & Johnson from the ABAT facility, which was an AU intervention at a time when African countries were not getting vaccines. Normally, for vaccines, because of storage and cold chain, you don't take all that you buy at the time. They are coming scheduled so that as and when you need them and you have the capacity to store them, I mean the cold fridges across the country, then you can take. Otherwise, they'll come and get spoiled, or they come in large numbers, you are not able to deploy, then they expire. So it comes to the schedule.
So that's Patrick Kumabwaji. But we observed from the Auditor General's report that the Chief Director of the Ministry of Health was questioned by the auditors, and he gave additional reasons why we have not received the $81 million worth of vaccines. He explained that the amount was paid, the total amount. We paid the total amount in anticipation of receiving all the vaccines within a short space of time for vaccination in the country. However, unexpected vaccine donations into the country, right? That was one reason. Unexpected vaccine donation in the country, coupled with limited vaccine storage, which is what Dr. Kumabwaji, the current Director General, mentioned. And then the slow uptake by Ghanaians to be vaccinated made it impossible to receive the Janssen vaccines that had been paid for. Now, the Auditor General, this is the part that is interesting, and this is where, our research comes into play. The Auditor General recommends that the Chief Director of the Ministry of Health should renegotiate with UNICEF and AVAT to recover the outstanding amount. Government is yet to implement this recommendation to recover. However, as we are finding now in the budget, we have $81 million worth of vaccines still somewhere sitting with the supplier that hasn't been delivered, although we paid for. But we are finding the 2023 budget that we are budgeting to actually import more vaccines.
Absolutely. If you look at the 2023 budget, government has budgeted to spend an additional 4.3 million Ghana cedis on vaccine-related expenditure. Now, Evans, if you look at the detail of this expenditure, if you look at COVID-19 vaccines, operations and procurement will cost the state 1.83 million Ghana cedis. And if you look at COVID-19 response, vaccine response will cost the state 2.45 million Ghana cedis.
How much are we budgeting to use to import more vaccines?
So if you add the two, it's around 4.3 million Ghana cedis.
But there's a line item that talks about vaccines procurement.
Vaccine procurement is around 1.84 million Ghana cedis.
Okay, but that is the part that we found very curious, because you've already paid for $81 million worth that hasn't been delivered.
Absolutely.
And yet, Auditor General says recover that. You haven't recovered it, and yet you are budgeting to spend even more on vaccines. But we also found significant differences in the total amount the Auditor General claims to have audited when it comes to COVID-19 expenditure. And that conflicts a bit with the figures that we also find from the Ministry of Finance. The Auditor General claims that they audited a total of 21.8 billion cedis, right?
Yeah.
But that is exactly different from what the Finance Ministry claimed to Parliament.
So in 2022 June, when the finance minister appeared before Parliament, he said government mobilized 18.19 billion out of the program 19.3 billion in 2020. Now, if you look at what the Auditor General reported, the Ministry of Finance mobilized a total of 19.11 billion in 2020 to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. If you look at the difference between what the Finance Minister reported and what the Auditor General is reporting right now, the difference is around 190 million Ghana cedis, Evans.
Okay, but then even the specific years, the Auditor General claims that, for example, in 2021, we mobilized 1.9 billion.
Exactly.
But that's not what the Finance Ministry says.
So the Finance Ministry said they wanted to mobilize, or they mobilized close to 3.9 billion Ghana cedis. And if you look at expenditure for COVID-19 in 2020, Finance Ministry reported 8.12 billion. Auditor General reported 8.66 billion. The difference is huge. Expenditure on COVID-19 2021 again, Finance Ministry reported 3.91 billion. And Auditor General reported 3.08 billion.
In all the cases, the Auditor General was auditing significantly less numbers than what the Finance Ministry itself claims we spent
exactly,
on. And so we try to find out what is accounting for the discrepancy, because it's important. It's all about how much we got and how much we spent. Everybody is, amazed, shocked at the figures, but we're actually discovering that the figures that have been audited significantly less compared to what the finance ministry claims they actually spent. So some reconciliation needs to happen. But we discovered, when we did a bit closer investigation, the sources of the funding may explain something here, because the Auditor General claims that the sources that they audited included monies we received from the Contingency Fund, the World Bank Group, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, the Africa Development Bank, the European Union, and the sale of BOG COVID-19 bonds.
In total, 6.
In total, 6 sources.
6 sources.
Okay. We discovered that it appears that the Auditor General did not audit some other sources.
Yeah.
Let's go
So
into
if
that.
you look at the Finance Ministry, they considered 9 sources. So you've mentioned
they received funds
from 9 sources. Exactly. So you've mentioned the Contingency Fund, the World Bank Group, IMF, AFDB, European Union, and then GOG, bonds. But there's also what the Auditor General failed to report on, that is funds from the Korea government, funds from Germany, and then also government of Ghana's own funds that they gave to the government to mitigate the impact of the COVID-19. So if you look at what the Auditor General reported on 6 sources, but the Finance Minister, when he appeared before Parliament in June 2022, reported from 9 different sources that they got money from for COVID-19.
So that is a significant lapse there that needs to be reconciled, because if the Ministry of Finance says we got funding from 9 sources, but only 6 of those have been audited, then, and even this is left to a lot of shock.
Absolutely.
You can imagine what will happen if they additionally audit the remainder of the 3 that they haven't looked into, where they could also obviously be possibly other gaps and dissipation as they found in this one. But also, Kofi, we also found in something very interesting in this document, because we are in this current economic crisis, as many governments have said, because of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Exactly.
And how we spend the monies that we received on things, right? But when you put the monies together, we are beginning to realize that the monies that we got from all these sources to sort of mitigate the impact of COVID could be significantly more than what even the IMF have given us in the past.
So we've been to the IMF 16 times. And if you look at the monies that we've gained from the IMF rise from 1966 to 2015, it's around $2.5 billion. And what COVID-19, the COVID-19 inflows that we got from 2020 and 2021, in dollar terms, around $3.1 billion.
Okay, so let's break that down again. For the 16 times we've been to the IMF, the total of what?
$2.5 billion.
Okay. And then just in the space of what, 2-3 years?
Well, 2 years.
2 years.
Yeah.
2020.
2021.
Yes.
Mind you that what the Finance Ministry reported did not cover 2022.
Yes.
So if you look at the data that the finance ministry reported, and if you quantify the money, it's around $3.1 billion
In 2 years.
In 2 years.
And yet in more than 20 years, right? That is in more than 20
Exactly,
years.
yeah.
We received just over 2 billion.
2.5 billion, yeah.
And yet in 2 years, we received sort of largely aid, same, right? To
yeah.
help the economy,
Yeah.
to find the budget, etc., of 3 billion.
It's exactly the same amount that we're actually looking for from the IMF. So we want 3 billion from the IMF. Already, COVID-19, within a span of 2 years, we got 3.1 billion from the IMF. In 2020, for instance, we got 19.3 billion from about 5 different sources. 5 billion from IMF, 1.3 billion from World Bank, European Union gave us 504 million Ghana cedis, AFDB 405, Bank of Ghana 10 billion Ghana cedis, and GOG contingency fund was around 1.2 billion. If you add the two, if you add all these 6 sources for 2020, it was around 19.3 billion Ghana cedis.
Okay, and so that let us sink in for a minute. Just in those 2 years, the amount of money the government of Ghana received, and yet in 2023 we are talking about a debt action program.
Absolutely.
That if we don't do, this country will go completely bust. I want to bring in the chairman of the finance of the health committee in Parliament, Dr. Yue Friye. Hello, Doc. Thanks for your time here on Top Story.
Yeah, hello. Good evening, Evans.
I'm grateful that you could join us. Thankfully, we also have your ranking on the line with us, Mensah Kano. Mr. Kano, thanks for your time on Top Story.
You're welcome, brother.
Dr. Yefri, let me start. Give us an update. I know the Parliament, you set up a committee to probe the COVID-19 expenditure. What has become of that?
Yes, we actually had a leadership meeting, and we had to start hearing on the 7th of February. Yes, at 1 p.m. Yes, the last meeting, because of the business of the House, we had to write to Speaker to grant us the leave to commence our sitting when we resume Parliament. That's the first meeting of the session, yes.
So this is going to be a public hearing?
Yes, that was the agreement during the preliminary meetings of the committee. It was agreed that it's going to be a public hearing.
Mr. Mitakando, have you seen the Auditor General report at all?
Yes, I have.
And now that you're about to begin your own probe, how will that report influence that work? Are you going to rely on it at all? You're going to do a separate investigation?
As and when we must refer to it, we will do so. But I think that it is just the tip of the iceberg. I think that there's more to the COVID expenditure than what we have seen or heard in the Auditor General's report. And so, as the chairman has indicated, very soon we will start our work. And even if you could recall, these were the reasons that encouraged us, if I say us, those of us in the minority, to press home the demand or the need for a probe in the COVID expenditure. You recall at a point in time when the first deputy speaker was in the seat, he had to throw away our motion for the establishment of a bipartisan committee to look into the matter. But thanks be to God, we've moved on, and now the AG has done his bit, and we, as a bipartisan committee of Parliament, very soon will also begin doing our best.
You pointed out that this is an issue you've touched on in Parliament, you've campaigned for in Parliament for a probe. Do you feel vindicated by the findings in this Auditor General's report?
Well, it is not for the credit, but I humbly think that the good people of this country have understood why we're pressing for the probe into this matter. And so, yes, vindication, but I think that it's just the beginning, so it's too early to be taking credit. I think that we'll go the full haul, and at the end of the day, we need to protect Mother Ghana from all these things. So, Evans, too early to take credit, but hey, the point must also be established that the Auditor General didn't set out himself to audit the COVID expenditure. We fought it hard before getting to this point.
You mentioned that this could, what we're reading today, could be a tip of the iceberg. You're certain that there's more that the Auditor General could not discover.
Well, I think there are more questions, and I'll probably give you one or two examples. If you recall, somewhere 11th July, the country director World Bank made mention of the fact that within 1 year, Ghana had benefited for not less than $903 million. But if you read this particular report, what has been accounted for with regards to the World Bank is around 430 million. So probably when the various ministries or agencies appear before the committee, they will be able to explain why that discrepancy. And quite apart from the receipts and the expenditure, the appropriateness of an expenditure must also be questioned. And that one, too, with regards to that one, let me give you one example. If there's a fight against COVID-19 and you are doing, let's say, fumigation, we'll have to establish why fumigation will contribute to the fight against COVID-19. We'll have to establish why recapitalization of a bank will contribute to the fight against COVID-19. So there are more questions. I'm describing as questions, and I'm choosing my words carefully. And when they appear before us, there are a lot of issues we have to resolve. Remember the issue of 32 million Ghana cedis being used in a matter of 1 year, 2021, for meetings when President had imposed ban on travels. You remember those ones. So there are a lot of details that I have not read, that I have not seen, let me put it this way, that I have not seen in the Auditor General's report. So that is why I'm saying that probably the tip of the iceberg.
I mean, Dr. Free, finally to you. So you now have this Auditor General report just before you start your public sitting investigating the use of the COVID-19 expenditure. As I asked earlier, you are the chairman. Will you welcome this document as a base document, a reference point for your own work?
Oh, if it matters to do that, we will. I mean, the matter of the policy, and the Ministry of Health would have to respond to it. And same Parliament has a committee that is also responsible to delving into that issue. We don't intend to have our committee to be an overload of our committees and their responsibilities. However, if it matters that we will delve into that, we'll go into it.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time on Top Story. I want to bring in right now a research fellow at the Center for Democratic Development, Dr. Kwame Sarpong-Asiedu, joins us on Zoom right now. Doc, thank you for your time here on Top Story. You've described this whole COVID-19 expenditure as a facade to plunder. Explain.
Yes, Evans. I mean, look at it from the point of view of all you see in there. I mean, an insurance scheme was set up for health workers, which could not be executed if the insurers defaulted. How can that even be? You see things given to traditional rulers who cannot account for the money. How can that be? The more you go into this report, the more you see that all the questions that were being asked at the outset when COVID started as to the expenditure has not been dealt with earlier on simply because there was more going on and on and on in the background. So anytime the question was asked, it was pushed. And like you've heard Minta Akanda say, there are a lot more questions to be asked that do not fall within the remit of the Auditor General. And the more questions you ask, the more mess you see. What if not is a facade? We were pulled a smoke screen, things were done in the dark, and suddenly we are finding out the gravity of the mess. And I heard your colleague say 3.1 billion US dollars. Now we're going for 3 billion from the IMF. Meanwhile, you read the report and it says only 25% of that 3.1 billion was actually used in the fight against COVID. 75% was spent at the discretion of government. And then when you look at that 25%, you also see the amount of sleaze and anomalies that the Auditor General has identified, which tells you that less than 20% of those monies were actually used to fight COVID. Meanwhile, we are being told that this is the expenditure that has sent our economy down the drain and has led us to the island. In those expenditures, you can also see they are talking about COVID bonds that were sold to us. Now we are being told that there should be a debt exchange program because those bonds cannot be honored. What is a facade, Evans? And these are the reasons why I'm saying that this was a huge smoke screen to actually plunder the state. And I don't take anything away from what I said then.
So we've had the both the chairman and the ranking on the Parliamentary Committee on Health say next week, the 7th of February, they're beginning a public hearing. What do you make of that process? Should we leave Parliament to of course, this is an Auditor General's report, so eventually Parliament will have to deal with it. But then there's also another committee that's going to look into it before the Public Accounts Committee gets its bite. Would you recommend that to be the process of getting finality and closure to this? Or there should be more done to this particular issue?
We cannot even continue this whole thing where no one is held to account. All these reports come out, people read it, we shout, and that's the end of it. People have to be held accountable for these monies and any losses that the state has incurred. Because you have to bear in mind that a lot of these loans are for 25, 30 years. We would be paying, as we're paying now, our children would pay, and our grandchildren would come and pay as well. What crime have we committed? So it is not about getting closure because Parliament sat and Parliament called people and we heard in public what a mess they had done with our monies. People should be held accountable. I think the Auditor General should take steps to surcharge, and some of these monies should be clawed back to the state. It's not just right. It doesn't sit right with me.
You were talking about recovering the money. Should prosecution should the special prosecutor be interested in some of the details? Because you read some, they are over-invoicing, for example. The Buffer Stock Company, a case in point, where the chief executive is now being asked to refund monies. You think the special prosecutor possibly should take an interest in this?
Well, I mean, any state organization or institution that has interest in anything that happened under COVID, that smells of criminality. Like I said, if it quacks like a duck, swims like a duck, it's got wet feet, it likes water, then it probably is a duck. So if the special prosecutor reads the report like you and I have read and sees anything with the semblance of a duck that falls within his domain, then I would expect that he would go looking for that duck. So the answer is yes, he should take interest in it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kwame Sarpong-Asiedu. What do you make of that? I want to hear from you on Newsnight in a minute.